The icy blast of winter in 1878 cut through Violet Evans's woolen coat as she stood at the edge of the Arkansas River, mesmerized by the savage beauty of the rushing water that would soon become her greatest enemy and unlikely matchmaker. Pueblo, Colorado was not what Violet had expected when she'd left her comfortable life in Boston 3 months earlier. The frontier town was a stark contrast to the refined society she'd known, but it offered something Boston couldn't: freedom from the stifling expectations that had threatened to crush her spirit like a corset pulled too tight. At 22, Violet had already refused 3 marriage proposals from men her parents deemed suitable. None had stirred her heart, and Violet refused to settle for a loveless marriage of convenience. Her decision to accept a teaching position in Pueblo had scandalized Boston society, but education was Violet's passion, and the West needed teachers. The Arkansas River flowed through Pueblo, dividing the growing town. On this late February morning, the usually peaceful river was swollen from recent snowmelt in the distant mountains. Violet had ventured to its banks to sketch the dramatic scenery for a letter to her younger sister. The rushing water created a symphony of sounds, gurgling, crashing, and hissing as it carved its path through the rocky terrain. Violet tightened her scarf against the bitter cold and stepped closer to capture the way the morning light glinted off the rushing water. The riverbank was slick with frost, but her attention was focused on finding the perfect vantage point for her sketch. She didn't notice the section of bank beneath her feet had been undermined by the current. With no warning, the ground gave way. Violet plunged into the frigid water, the shock of cold stealing her breath as effectively as a thief in the night. The current immediately seized her, dragging her under and away from shore. Her heavy wool clothing, once protection against the cold, now threatened to pull her deeper into the merciless river. Violet fought against the current, but each attempt to surface ended with her being pulled back under. Her lungs burned for air, and panic took hold as she tumbled helplessly through the frigid water. Colton Alden had been riding along the river trail, returning to Pueblo after delivering a herd of cattle to a neighboring ranch. At 28, he was already making a name for himself as one of the most reliable cattlemen in the territory. Orphaned at 16, Colton had learned to rely on himself, working his way up from ranch hand to foreman, and finally saving enough to buy a small spread of his own just outside town. He'd spotted the woman by the river earlier, noting her city clothes and the careful way she moved along the bank. City folk often underestimated the dangers of frontier life, and something had made him circle back to check on her. When he returned, he arrived just in time to see her disappear into the churning water. Without hesitation, Colton leaped from his horse and sprinted to the river's edge. He spotted her red scarf in the water about 30 yards downstream, being pulled toward a dangerous section of rapids. Tearing off his heavy coat and boots, he dove into the icy water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but years of working outdoors in all conditions had hardened Colton against nature's extremes. Strong, powerful strokes carried him toward Violet, who was barely staying afloat. He reached her just as she slipped beneath the surface again. Colton grabbed her coat, pulling her up. "I've got you," he shouted over the roar of the river. Violet gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched at his shirt. "Stop fighting," Colton commanded. "Trust me and save your strength." Something in his steady gaze calmed her panic enough to listen. Colton maneuvered onto his back, keeping Violet's head above water as he fought against the current, angling toward the shore. Each stroke was a battle against the river's determination to claim them both. The rapids were approaching fast, a churning maelstrom of white water and hidden rocks that could easily kill them. With a final surge of desperate strength, Colton managed to angle them toward a small cove where the current slowed slightly. His feet scraped against the rocky bottom, and he used the leverage to push them toward the bank. With Violet clutched against his chest, Colton dragged them both onto the muddy shore. They collapsed on the bank, gasping for breath in the biting air that now felt like fire in their lungs. Are you all right, miss?" Colton managed between ragged breaths. Violet couldn't speak, shivering violently as the winter air froze her wet clothing. Her lips were turning blue, and Colton knew hypothermia was setting in quickly. "We need to get you warm." He struggled to his feet, his own limbs stiff from cold. Colton whistled sharply, and his well-trained horse trotted toward them along the bank. Retrieving his coat from where he'd dropped it, Colton wrapped it around Violet's shoulders. "My name's Colton Alden. I've got a cabin not far from here. Can you ride?" Violet nodded weakly, her teeth chattering too violently for speech. Colton lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. He held her securely with one arm while guiding the horse with the other, setting off at a careful trot toward his cabin. The 10-minute ride seemed to stretch for hours as Colton felt Violet's shivering intensify. He urged his horse faster, knowing that time was critical. His cabin appeared through the trees, a simple but solid structure with smoke already rising from the chimney, thanks to the banked fire he'd left that morning. Colton had built the place himself over 2 summers, a testament to his determination to carve out his own future in the West. Colton dismounted and lifted Violet down, carrying her inside. The cabin's warmth was a blessed relief after the bitter cold outside. He set her down gently on a chair near the stove. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, stoking the fire to build the heat quickly. "I'll find you something dry to wear." Violet nodded numbly, her fingers too frozen to manage the buttons of her coat. Colton hesitated, then knelt before her. "Miss, I don't mean any impropriety, but you'll die of cold if you stay in these wet things. Will you allow me to help?" Violet met his eyes, seeing nothing but genuine concern. "Yes," she whispered through chattering teeth. With respectful efficiency, Colton helped remove her coat, then turned his back while she struggled with her dress. He handed her a flannel shirt and trousers from his own clothes. "They'll be too big, but they're dry and warm. I'll step outside while you change." "And no," Violet managed, "just turn around. Too cold outside." Colton faced the wall as Violet changed with fumbling fingers. The cabin's single room offered little privacy, but survival took precedence over propriety. "Done," she finally said. Colton turned to find her swimming in his clothes, her wet garments puddled on the floor. He quickly gathered them and hung them near the stove to dry, then wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Can you tell me your name, miss?" he asked, putting a kettle on the stove for coffee. "Violet Evans," she replied, her shivering beginning to subside. "I'm the new school teacher in Pueblo." Colton's eyebrows rose. "The Boston lady. Folks in town have been talking about you since you arrived." Violet managed a weak smile. "Not all good things, I imagine. Mostly curious." Colton poured hot coffee into a mug and added a generous spoonful of honey before handing it to her. "Drink this. It'll warm you from the inside." As Violet sipped the sweet coffee, color gradually returned to her face. Colton busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, giving her time to recover. "Thank you for saving my life," Violet finally said, her voice stronger. "I don't know what I was thinking, standing so close to the edge." "The river's treacherous this time of year," Colton replied. "Snowmelt makes it unpredictable. Even folks who have lived here all their lives know to give it respect." Violet nodded, embarrassed by her carelessness. "I was trying to sketch it for my sister. She loves my drawings. You're an artist then, as well as a teacher. Hardly an artist, just sketches to help my sister imagine what it's like out here. Violet looked around the cabin for the first time, noting the simple but well-crafted furniture and the surprising touches of comfort bookshelves filled with volumes, colorful quilts, even a small collection of carved wooden animals on a shelf. "You read," she observed, nodding toward the books. Colton looked slightly embarrassed. "When there's time, winters get long out here." "What do you enjoy reading?" "History mostly. Some poetry," he shrugged, surprised. "That a cowboy reads poetry, perhaps a little," Violet admitted. "Don't let the boots and hat fool you, Miss Evans. We're not all illiterate ruffians out here." There was no anger in his tone, just gentle amusement that made Violet flush with shame at her own prejudices. "I apologize. That was presumptuous of me." Colton waved away her apology. "No offense taken. I'd probably make similar assumptions about city folk." He served the simple meal, and they ate in companionable silence. Violet studied her rescuer properly for the first time. Colton Alden was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue that contrasted with his dark hair and beard, which was neatly trimmed rather than wild as she might have expected. There was a quiet strength about him, an air of self-sufficiency tempered with kindness. "How long have you been in Pueblo?" Colton asked as they finished eating. 3 months. I arrived just before Thanksgiving." "And how does our little town compare to Boston?" Violet considered the question. "It's different in every way imaginable. Rougher, certainly. Less concerned with appearances and social standing. But there's an honesty to life here that's refreshing." Colton nodded. "That's a fair assessment. Life's harder out here, but it's real. A person is judged by what they do, not who their parents were or how much money they have." "Is that why you came west?" Violet asked. A shadow crossed Colton's face. "Partly. My parents died when I was 16, farm in Ohio. After that, there wasn't much to keep me there, and the West offered opportunities for a boy willing to work hard." "I'm sorry about your parents," Violet said softly. "It was a long time ago." Colton stood and checked her clothes, which were beginning to steam in the heat from the stove. "These'll need a while longer. How are you feeling now?" "Much better, thank you. The shivering has stopped." "Good. We'll need to get you back to town before nightfall, though. Wouldn't want to damage your reputation by having you spend the night in a bachelor's cabin." Violet hadn't considered the impropriety of her situation until that moment. In Boston, being alone with a man like this would have ruined her socially. But they were far from Boston, and circumstances were different. "I suppose that would cause quite a scandal," she said with a small smile. "Folks here are surprisingly traditional about some things," Colton replied. "They might forgive a city lady for not knowing better, but they'd be harder on me for not respecting your position." Violet was touched by his consideration. "You've already risked your life for me today, Mr. Alden. I wouldn't want you to risk your standing in the community as well." "Colton, please." After fishing someone out of a river, last names seemed too formal. "Then you must call me Violet." For a moment their eyes met, and something sparked between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the cabin's windows. Colton moved to look outside, his expression growing concerned. "Weather's turning," he said. "We should start back soon if we're going to make it before dark." By the time Violet's clothes were dry enough to wear, the sky had darkened ominously. Colton lent her his heavy coat again, insisting he was used to the cold. "My horse can carry us both to town," he said as they stepped outside. "It'll be faster than walking." The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind carried the promise of snow. Colton helped Violet mount, then swung up behind her. The closeness was intimate but necessary for warmth as they set off toward Pueblo. They had covered less than half the distance when the storm hit in earnest. Snow swirled around them, reducing visibility to mere yards. "We need to turn back," Colton shouted over the wind. "We'll never make town in this," Violet nodded, too cold to argue. Colton turned the horse around, urging it back toward the safety of the cabin. By the time they returned, several inches of snow already covered the ground. Colton quickly stabled his horse in the small lean-to beside the cabin, ensuring the animal had food and unfrozen water before hurrying Violet inside. "Looks like we're stuck here until this passes," he said, shaking snow from his hat. "These spring storms usually blow themselves out by morning." Violet stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, suddenly very aware of their situation. "What will people think?" Colton stoked the fire before answering. "They'll think we had the good sense not to freeze to death trying to be proper." He straightened and met her worried gaze. "Your reputation matters to you." It wasn't a question, but Violet answered anyway. "In Boston, a woman's reputation is everything. Out here, I'm still learning the rules." "The rules are simpler than you might think," Colton said. "Be honest, work hard, and help your neighbors when they need it. The rest tends to sort itself out." "Is it really that simple?" "Not always," he admitted, "but it's a good place to start." As the evening progressed, the initial awkwardness faded. Colton proved to be an excellent host, entertaining Violet with stories of his early days in the West while they shared a simple supper of cornbread and the last of the beans. In turn, Violet described Boston's ornate architecture and cultural attractions, painting pictures with her words that made Colton see the city through her eyes. "You miss it," he observed as she described the Boston Public Garden in spring. "Parts of it," Violet admitted. "The libraries, the museums, the music, but not the constraints." "What constraints drove a proper Boston lady to become a frontier schoolteacher?" Violet hesitated, then decided honesty was the fairest response to the man who'd saved her life. "My parents had my future planned since birth. The right schools, the right friends, the right husband, a man chosen more for his bank account and family connections than any compatibility with me. And that didn't suit you. I want to choose my own path." "Is that so unreasonable?" Colton smiled. "Not to me. That's why most of us came west to write our own stories." When it came time to sleep, Colton insisted Violet take the bed while he made a pallet on the floor near the stove. The arrangement was far from proper, but Violet was too exhausted to protest. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind howling outside and the occasional shifting of logs in the stove. Morning brought clear skies and a transformed landscape. Snow blanketed everything, pristine and glittering in the early sunlight. After a breakfast of coffee and johnnycakes, Colton saddled his horse for the journey to town. "Ready to face the gossips?" he asked as he helped Violet mount. "I suppose I'll have to be," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "Thank you for everything, Colton. I owe you my life." "Just doing what anyone would do," he said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Not everyone would have risked the freezing river to save a stranger. The ride to Pueblo was beautiful but cold. By the time they reached town, Violet's boarding house was in sight, and she could see her landlady, Mrs. Hollister, sweeping snow from the front steps. The older woman froze mid-sweep when she spotted Violet returning with Colton. "Brace yourself," Colton murmured as he helped Violet dismount. "Mrs. Hollister supplies half the gossip in Pueblo." Sure enough, Mrs. Hollister hurried toward them, her face a mix of relief and suspicion. "Miss Evans, we were worried sick when you didn't come home last night." "Mrs. Hollister, I owe my life to Mr. Alden," Violet said firmly. I fell into the river yesterday and he rescued me at great personal risk. The storm prevented our return to town. Mrs. Hollister's eyes widened. The river? In this weather? My dear, you're fortunate to be alive. Indeed I am, thanks to Mr. Alden's courage. Colton tipped his hat. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, madam. Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly. Colton Alden had a good reputation in Pueblo, hardworking, honest, and not given to carousing like some of the other young men. Well, you'd best come inside and warm up, Miss Evans. I'll have Betsy prepare a hot bath for you. She gave Colton a nod that was almost approving. Thank you for bringing our teacher back safely, Mr. Alden. Violet turned to Colton, suddenly reluctant to part. Will I see you again? Pueblo's not that big, he replied with a smile. I'm sure our paths will cross. He tipped his hat again. Take care near the river, Miss Evans. I will. Violet watched him ride away, struck by an unexpected sense of loss. In just 24 hours, Colton Alden had shifted from stranger to what? Not quite a friend, but something significant nonetheless. News of Violet's misadventure spread through Pueblo with predictable speed. By Monday morning, when she returned to her one-room schoolhouse, even her students had heard exaggerated accounts of her ordeal. Miss Evans, did you really fight a bear in the river? Asked 8-year-old Tommy Wilson. Mr. Peterson said you were half dead when Mr. Alden found you, added Sarah Miller, wide-eyed. Violet used the opportunity for an impromptu lesson on the dangers of the river and the importance of factual reporting versus rumor. She downplayed the drama, but made sure the children understood how fortunate she'd been that Colton had been nearby. In the weeks that followed, Violet found herself watching for Colton whenever she went into town. She spotted him occasionally loading supplies at the general store, talking with other ranchers outside the bank, tipping his hat politely when their paths crossed. Each brief encounter left her with a flutter of awareness she'd never experienced before. March brought milder weather, and the snow began to recede. One Saturday afternoon, Violet was selecting books at Pueblo's small lending library when a familiar voice behind her made her heart skip. The Iliad, ambitious reading for a schoolteacher. Violet turned to find Colton holding a copy of Thoreau's Walden. Homer is always worth revisiting, she replied, and Thoreau seems fitting for a man who lives so close to nature. I've been meaning to read it for years. Finally have some time now that the worst of winter's passed. He hesitated, then asked, How have you been, Violet? No more river mishaps, I hope. None. I've become exceedingly cautious around water of any kind, she smiled. Even bath water. Colton laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Glad to hear it. I'd hate to have to fish you out of the washtub. Their conversation continued as they walked out of the library together, discovering shared interests in literature and history. When they reached the town square, Colton seemed reluctant to end their talk. Would you care to join me for coffee at the hotel restaurant? He asked. Unless you have other obligations, of course. I'd like that, Violet replied, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Over coffee, their conversation deepened. Colton described his dreams for his small ranch, expanding his herd, breeding stronger cattle that could withstand Colorado's harsh winters. Violet shared her hopes of eventually starting a proper school with multiple classrooms and teachers. Pueblo's growing, Colton observed. Your dream might not be that far off. Perhaps. The town council seems receptive, but funding is always an issue. Speaking of the council, there's a spring social next weekend, a fundraiser for town improvements. Would you consider attending with me? Colton asked, his usually confident demeanor showing a hint of uncertainty. The invitation took Violet by surprise. A public social event together would signal something more than casual acquaintance to the town. "I'd be delighted," she found herself saying, realizing she meant it. The spring social was held in the newly completed town hall, decorated with early wildflowers and ribbon streamers. Violet wore her best dress blue silk that brought out her eyes, saved from her Boston life for special occasions. When Colton arrived to escort her, freshly shaved and wearing a suit instead of his usual work clothes, Mrs. Hollister gave them an approving nod. "You look beautiful," Colton said, genuine admiration in his eyes. "And you clean up quite nicely yourself," Violet replied, taking his offered arm. The social was well attended, with nearly everyone in Pueblo present. Colton introduced Violet to ranchers and merchants she hadn't yet met through her teaching. She was surprised to discover how well respected he was, despite his relative youth and modest holdings. "Mr. Alden's got a good head for business," explained Mr. Thornton, the bank manager. "Started with almost nothing 5 years ago. Now he's got one of the best small herds in the county." "You make me sound like a tycoon, Thornton," Colton said with a laugh. "I'm just trying to build something that'll last." When the small orchestra began playing, Colton turned to Violet. "Would you honor me with a dance?" They moved gracefully together, Violet surprised by Colton's skill. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance like this?" she asked. "My mother insisted I learn. Said a man who could dance would never lack for friends." His expression grew wistful. "She loved music, used to play the piano every evening after supper." "You still miss them," Violet said softly. "Your parents." "Every day, but it gets easier." He twirled her gently. "What about your family? Do you write to them?" "My sister regularly. My parents, less often. They still hope I'll come to my senses and return to Boston." "And will you?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. "I don't think so," Violet said slowly. "I've found something here I never had in Boston." "What's that?" "Freedom to discover who I really am, not who I was expected to be." Colton's eyes held hers. "And who is Violet Evans becoming?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," she admitted. "But I'm enjoying the discovery." The evening ended too quickly. As Colton walked Violet back to her boarding house, they paused beneath the stars. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," he said. "I'd like to see you again if you're willing." "I'd like that too," Violet replied. Colton hesitated, then leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he brushed his lips against hers in a gentle kiss that ended far too soon. "Good night, Violet," he whispered. "Good night, Colton." As spring progressed into summer, Colton and Violet's courtship became a topic of fond interest in Pueblo. They rode together on Sundays, exploring the beautiful countryside. Colton taught Violet to fish in the calmer parts of the river, far from where she'd fallen in. She introduced him to Shakespeare, reading aloud while they picnicked under cottonwood trees. Violet became a regular visitor at Colton's ranch, always properly chaperoned by Mrs. Hollister's niece, a cheerful girl who was happy to sit with a book while they walked the property. Colton showed Violet his plans for expansion, a larger barn, additional grazing land, maybe even a proper house someday to replace the cabin. "You've thought everything through," Violet observed as they stood on a hilltop overlooking the valley. "I believe in building for the future," Colton replied. "A man should have dreams bigger than himself." In July, Violet took Colton to meet her students during a special summer session she'd organized for those who needed extra help. She watched as he patiently explained cattle breeding to fascinated children, using simple terms they could understand. "You're good with them," she said afterward. "They're good kids. Smart too with the right teacher." His admiration was evident in his voice. By August, Violet realized she had fallen deeply in love with Colton Alden. The feeling terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. In Boston, She had rejected suitors because they didn't touch her heart. Now her heart was fully engaged, and the vulnerability was overwhelming. Colton invited Violet to a harvest dinner at his ranch in early September. He'd asked several neighbors to attend, making it a proper social gathering. The evening was perfect, lanterns hanging from trees, tables set up in the yard, and food contributed by everyone, creating a feast unlike anything Violet had experienced in Boston's formal dining rooms. After dinner, while the others were distracted by a storytelling contest, Colton drew Violet away from the group. "I need to show you something," he said, leading her toward a small copse of trees beyond the cabin. In a clearing stood the beginnings of a house foundation, sturdy stone footings and the start of a wooden frame. "You're building a house," Violet said, surprised. Colton hadn't mentioned such a major project. "I'm building a home," he corrected softly. He took her hands in his. "Violet, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I never expected to find someone like you, intelligent, brave, and beautiful in ways that go far beyond appearance." Violet's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "I started this house with you in mind," Colton continued. "It has space for a library, windows positioned to capture the best light for your drawing, even a small room that could serve as a nursery school someday." He took a deep breath. "But I won't finish it unless you say yes." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Violet Evans, I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Violet's eyes. This proposal was nothing like the calculated offers she'd received in Boston. This was real, a man offering his heart along with a future they would build together. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Colton, I love you, and nothing would make me happier than being your wife." When he rose to kiss her, Violet felt as though her life had finally found its true course, not the path her parents had planned, but one far more rewarding. They married in October 1879, when the cottonwoods along the Arkansas River had turned golden. The ceremony took place in Pueblo's small church, filled to capacity with townspeople, Colton's ranching colleagues, and Violet's students. Even Violet's sister had traveled from Boston for the occasion, though her parents had refused the invitation. "They'll come around eventually," her sister whispered as she helped Violet prepare. "When they see how happy you are." The wedding celebration continued well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the county. As twilight fell, Colton and Violet slipped away to begin their new life together. The house wasn't yet complete, but the cabin had been transformed with Violet's touches: curtains at the windows, colorful quilts on the bed, and bookshelves now filled with their combined collections. It was small but perfect for starting their life together. That first winter as a married couple brought challenges and joys. Heavy snows isolated them for days at a time, but they found contentment in each other's company. Violet continued teaching, riding to town with Colton when weather permitted. Together they finished the house, moving in just before Christmas 1879. Their first major test came in the spring of 1880, when unusually heavy rains and rapid snowmelt caused the Arkansas River to flood. The water didn't reach their home on higher ground, but it devastated many farms and ranches in the valley. Colton worked tirelessly alongside neighbors to rescue livestock and repair damage. Violet organized the town's women to provide meals and shelter for displaced families. "This is why I love the West," Colton told her one night after returning home exhausted from helping rebuild a neighbor's barn. "People here stand together." "It reminds me of the day we met," Violet said, massaging his sore shoulders. "One person reaching out to help another in need." As their first anniversary approached, Violet had news to share. On a crisp September evening, she prepared Colton's favorite meal and waited nervously for his return from town. "Something smells wonderful," he said, hanging his hat by the door and kissing her hello. During dinner, Violet could barely contain her excitement. Finally, as they sat before the fireplace afterward, she took Colton's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said, watching his face transform with wonder. "A baby," he repeated, voice thick with emotion. "When?" "Dr. Marshall says sometime in April." Colton gathered her into his arms, his joy palpable. "I've never been so happy," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me." "Best decision I ever made," Violet replied, remembering how close she'd come to drowning that February day. "The river tried to take my life, but it gave me something far greater instead." The following April, their son was born strong and healthy with his father's blue eyes and a powerful set of lungs that announced his arrival to the world. They named him Samuel, after Colton's father, with Thomas as a middle name to honor Violet's grandfather. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Colton's careful breeding program produced cattle well suited to Colorado's climate, and his reputation for fair dealing brought business from as far away as Denver. Violet continued teaching part-time, bringing Samuel with her when Colton was busy with ranch work. In 1882, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, completing their family. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons: spring calving, summer growing, fall harvest, and winter planning. They added rooms to the house as needed, creating the home they'd both dreamed of. Violet's parents finally visited in 1883, arriving with trunks of gifts and considerable skepticism about their daughter's choices. They stayed for 2 weeks, gradually warming to Colton's straightforward charm and obvious devotion to Violet and the children. By the time they departed, tentative plans had been made for a return visit the following year. "Your father asked if I'd consider expanding into the mercantile business," Colton told Violet after waving goodbye to her parents' departing carriage. "And what did you tell him?" "That I was a cattleman, not a shopkeeper." Colton smiled, "But I appreciated his advice on investments." "He knows his business, your father. He's finally seeing you for who you are," Violet said. "Not just the cowboy who pulled his daughter from a river." "That cowboy is still part of who I am," Colton replied, wrapping an arm around her waist. "And grateful every day for the current that brought you to me." As the years passed, Pueblo grew from frontier town to thriving city. Violet's dream of a proper school became reality, with her serving as headmistress until the children were older, then returning to teaching her beloved literature classes. Colton expanded his operations, eventually owning one of the largest cattle operations in southern Colorado. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, showing a natural aptitude for ranching from an early age. Elizabeth inherited her mother's love of books and art, along with her father's determination. Both children grew strong and independent, secure in their parents' love. On cold winter evenings, the family would gather before the fire, and Colton would tell the story of how he'd spotted a city lady sketching by the dangerous river. The children never tired of hearing how their father had dove into the freezing water to save their mother. "Were you scared, Papa?" Elizabeth would ask. "Terrified," Colton always answered honestly. "But sometimes the things most worth doing are the things that frighten us most." On their 20th anniversary, Colton surprised Violet with a trip to Boston to visit her sister and show their children the city where their mother had grown up. The visit was a revelation for Samuel and Elizabeth, who had known only the wide open spaces of Colorado. "You ever miss it?" Colton asked Violet as they walked through the public garden she described to him so long ago. The city. Sometimes, Violet admitted, but it's not home anymore. Home is wherever you and the children are. They stood on the bridge over the small lagoon, watching swans glide across the water. The river brought us together, Colton said, but it's love that's kept us together all these years. Love and stubborn determination, Violet added with a smile. You weren't about to let the river win that day. Best fight I ever picked, Colton agreed, kissing her tenderly. Returning to Colorado, they found comfort in the familiar landscape, the distant mountains, the rolling prairie, and the ever-present Arkansas River flowing through Pueblo. The same river that had nearly claimed Violet's life now watered their land and sustained their cattle, a constant reminder of how quickly life could change and how precious each moment truly was. In 1898, 20 years after they met, Violet and Colton stood on the banks of the Arkansas River at the spot where she'd fallen in. The winter had been mild, and the water flowed peacefully beneath a clear February sky. They had come to mark the anniversary with a private moment away from the bustling ranch and growing family. Samuel was married now with a child of his own, and Elizabeth was engaged to a young doctor from Denver. It doesn't look dangerous at all today, Violet observed, her hand firmly in Colton's. Water has many moods, Colton replied. Like life itself. They had weathered their own storms over 2 decades, drought years that threatened the ranch, Violet's difficult recovery after Elizabeth's birth, the loss of Colton's closest friend in a riding accident. Each challenge had strengthened rather than weakened their bond. You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by that day? Violet asked. No, Colton said firmly. Some things are meant to be, Violet. I believe I was supposed to be here when you needed me most. And I've needed you every day since, she said softly. As I've needed you. He drew her close. The river may have brought us together, but we chose to build this life. Every decision, every struggle, every joy, we created this together. As they walked back toward home, Violet reflected on how far they had come from that desperate moment in the freezing river. The frightened Boston schoolteacher and the brave young cowboy had grown into partners who faced life's challenges side by side. Their love had deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. The house came into view solid, welcoming, filled with memories of the life they'd built. Smoke curled from the chimney where a fire waited to warm them, and lights glowed in windows that promised comfort and belonging. It's still strange to think, Violet said as they approached, that if I hadn't fallen into that river, we might never have met. I'd have found you somehow, Colton replied with certainty. If not by the river, then in town. If not, then another time. Some things are simply meant to be. Violet squeezed his hand, believing him. In a territory as vast as Colorado, with all its dangers and distances, they had found each other. The river that might have ended her life had instead given her everything she'd never known. She wanted: true partnership, meaningful work, the joy of family, and love deep enough to weather any storm. As they entered their home together, Violet knew with absolute certainty that the current that had pulled her under that frigid February day had, in its own powerful way, carried her exactly where she was meant to be.